Na po tayo ngayon no, sa klase natin. So, we are already in our week 7. So, this is already our midterm lesson. Our topic in Psych 111 or General Psychology is Learning and Thinking. Okay? So, here's our outline. So, we're going to tackle about what is learning, also including classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and of course, observational learning. So what is learning? So by the end of this objectives of this section, you will be able to explain how learned behaviors are different from instincts and reflexes. Define learning. How do you define learning? Recognize and define 3 basic forms of learning: the classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So here's our introduction. Birds build nests and migrate as winter approaches. Infants suckle at their mother's breast. Dogs shake water off with fur. Salmon swim upstream to spawn, and spiders spin intricate webs. What these seemingly unrelated behaviors have in common? So ano pong kaibahan nito? No? They are all unlearned behaviors, meaning both instinct and reflexes are innate. Meaning, pag anak sa'yo dyan, nalilearn mo na yan. Okay, marunong ka na yan. O maybe if you're not marunong, konting training na lang. Marunong ka na. Example, sabi nga dito yung paglipad ng bird. Okay? And are innate behaviors that organisms are born with. Okay? Reflexes. So, ano yung reflexes? Reflexes are a motor or neutral reaction to specific stimulus in the environment. So they tend to be simpler than instincts, involve the activity of specific body parts and systems. So, example, knee-jerk reflexes and construction of the pupil, that's your reflex, and involve more primitive centers and central nervous system, the spinal cord and the medulla. But in contrast, instinct are innate also. They're also innate. Innate behavior that are triggered by a broader range of events, such as aging and change of seasons. They are more complex than of behavior involve movement, the organism as a whole. Example, sexual activity, migration. So, meron tayo ibang sexual instinct. Anong instinct? And involve higher brain centers. So, how do you define learning? Pag marunong ka ba sa isang bagay, ibig sabihin ba na-learn mo na yung bagay na yan? Or, let's have this definition of learning. So, learning pala, according to the book, is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience. In contrast to innate behaviors dissolved, learning involves acquiring knowledge and skills through experience. So, ang learning pala, sabi dito, permanent change in behavior that results from the experience. So, pag may natutunan ka bang isang bagay, pag may natutunan kang bagay, ibig ba sabihin doon na learn mo na yan? Hindi po. Pag may change na in behavior or knowledge, nagkameron na, of course, at may nagkameron na ng changes, learning na po yung tawag dyan. Unlike instincts and reflexes, walang nagbago. In contrast to innate behaviors, learning involves acquiring knowledge through skills. Natututunan mo talaga. Okay po? So, yung learning para dapat talaga, pag hindi lang porket may natutunan ka, dapat din po, may nabago. May nabago sa behavior mo. Kasi change of behavior kasi siya. Okay? So, let's talk about what is associative learning. Associative learning occurs when our organism makes connection between stimuli or events that occurs together. So, you make association through learning, make connection between stimuli and events. You will see that associative learning is central to all 3 basic learning processes discussed in this chapter. So, makikita daw natin yung associative learning sa lahat ng to. Sa classical conditioning, tends to involve unconscious processes. And operant conditioning tends to involve conscious processes. And observational learning adds social and cognitive layers to all the basic associative processes, both conscious and unconscious. So, in classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, kasi kay Ivan Pavlov to, kaya Pavlovian na yung also known as classical conditioning. Organisms learn to associate events or stimuli that repeatedly happen together. We experience this process throughout daily lives. So, pag paulit-ulit palagi yung nangyayari yung isang bagay, paulit-ulit na pinapayari sa atin, meron tayong natutunan. No? We associate this. Organisms learn to associate these things pag paulit-ulit na. So, ano to? Here's a picture, example. In operant conditioning, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, a response is associated with the consequences. This dog has learned that certain behaviors result in a receiving threat. Okay? So, ano naman po yung classical conditioning? So, classical conditioning, okay, by the end of the section, you will learn about, explain how classical conditioning occurs. So, does the name Ivan Pavlov ring a bell? Yes. Even if you are new to the study of psychology, chances are that you have heard Pavlov and his famous dogs. So, ito yung idea ni Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov, by the way, is a Russian, siya. From Russian scientist, performed extensive research on dogs and is best known for his experiment in classical conditioning. As we discussed briefly in the previous section, classical conditioning is a process by which we learn to associate stimuli consequently to anticipate events. So, pag meron na tayo na-associate na mga stimuli, meaning something else, na nagiging response natin, nakaka-anticipate na kaagad tayo ng events, meaning nakaka-imagine na kaagad, ay, ito yung mangyayari. Kasi nakita ko to, ay ito na yung mangyayari kasi na-feel ko to. No? We've been conditioned. So, ano ito yung picture ng Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov research on digestive systems of dogs unexpectedly, no? Hindi niya sinadya, led to the discovery of the learning process now known as classical conditioning. So, kasi sa Ivan Pavlov, digestive system lang yung isdihan niya. And then, na-learning yung salivation through the bell. So, ano itong mangyari ito? So, Ivan Pavlov experiments the dogs salivated each time meat powder was presented to them. The meat powder in this situation was an unconditioned stimulus. So, yung meat powder na yun yung unconditioned stimulus na nakaka-trigger kung ano yung response ng dog. A stimulus that elicits a reflexive response in an organism. The dog salivation was an unconditioned response. So, yung paglalaway na ng aso, yun yung unconditioned response. Natural po yung conditions. Meaning, unconditioned response, hindi mo muna kinondisyon yung response na yun. Okay? Natural yung unlearned reaction to a given stimulus. Before conditioning, think of dog stimulus and response like this. So, meat powder, unconditioned siya. Salivation, unconditioned response siya. So, in classical conditioning, a neutral stimulus is presented immediately before an unconditioned stimulus. So, Pavlov would sound a tone, ring a bell, and then give the dog the meat powder. Okay? The tone was the neutral stimulus. So, example, bibigyan mo siya ng, magre-ring ka ng bell. Bigyan mo kaagad ng meat powder. So, yung meat powder, yun yung neutral stimulus, which is a stimulus that does not naturally elicit response. Okay, yung tone na yun. Prior to conditioning, the dog did not salivate when they just hear the tone, because the tone was no association for the dog. Quite simply, pairing means, pero pag pinair mo na yung sound ng bell ng meat powder, magkakameron na yung salivation. So, here's the catch. Paano mo ngayon may i-elicit yung salivation? By just one stimulus. So, when Pavlov paired the tone with the meat over and over again, pinaulit-ulit niya. Okay, ito yung sikreto dyan. Pag ginondisyon mo yun, inulit ni Pavlov yung bell, meat powder, bell, meat powder, bell, meat powder, and immediately, naglalaway na yung aso. Salivation came. And the previously neutral stimulus, the tone, neutral lang yun siya, walang nangyayari, also began to elicit salivation. So, nagkameron na po siya ng salivation kasi nga ito, no, pinarisan mo na ng meat powder which is unconditioned stimulus. Thus, the neutral stimulus became conditioned stimulus. So, yung neutral stimulus na yon, yung tone, okay, naging conditioned stimulus siya, which is a stimulus that elicits a response after repeatedly being paired with unconditioned stimulus. So, eventually, yung tone na yon, tunog lang, bell lang, okay, eventually, the dogs began to salivate to the tone alone. Sa tunog pa lang, no, kasi before, no, tone, meat powder, ito, tone, meat powder, paulit-ulit, hanggang sa naglalaway ng aso, right now, it becomes a conditional stimulus na. Okay? No? So eventually, the dogs began to salivate to the tone alone. Yan yung na-learn ni Pablo. Nakakondisyon pala yung aso. Ito yung binibigay. Kaya ano yung mga sekreto ng mga aso na nakakalakad, natitrain yung aso? Ito yung ginagamit talaga nila. Okay? Na pang-kondisyon sa mga hayop. Just as they previously had salivated at the sound of the assistant footstep, the behavior caused by the conditioned stimulus is called the conditioned response. So yung pag-behavior na yun na na-condition na, meaning conditioned response na rin po yung tawag din. Yung pag-salivate, yung salivation na na-condition na, yung tawag doon is conditioned response na. So in the case of Pavlov's dog, they had learned to associate the tone. So meron na association. So meaning associative learning na po yan yung tawag yan. With being fed, they began to salivate, meaning conditioned response na po, in anticipation of food. So, ito na yung nangyari. Tone lang yung ginawa. Okay, ngayon, binawasan na yung powder meat, nagkameron na ng salivation. Now, we have already conditioned our dog. No? Tone lang, nakakapag-salivate na siya. How about yung dog mo? Tone, meat powder, i-process mo, tone, meat powder, yung unconditioned response siya is tatayo siya. Tone pa rin, tone, meat powder, tatayo siya. Darating yung araw na tone lang, tunog lang ng bell, tatayo na yung aso. So kayo yung mga talent shows, di ba? Tunog lang ng isang bagay, tumatayo na yung aso, gumagalaw, pinapasunod nila, no, di ba, mga bell. Ito yung ginagamit talaga nila. Itong na discover ni Ivan Pavlov, na Pavlovian conditioning. Okay? So, it's a helpful thing. So, ito din yung nangyayari sa there is happening this change in behavior. Okay? Ito din yung ginagamit ng ibang tao, no, ng ibang tao pag nagkami sa mga taong gustong turuan ng leksyon. So, ginagawa to hanggang sa maturuan na ng leksyon. Ginagawa dito sa mga criminal system, sa mga kulungan, in discipline. So, this is a helpful thing talaga. So, if we have a clients in social work, example, pag dumating tayo, no, pagkagalitan natin sila, example, ganon. So, presensya lang natin, example, pag dumating tayo, pinapagalitan natin sila. So, pagdating lang natin, nagkakameron sila ng respeto. Okay, nagiging matino na kaagad sila, presensya pa lang natin. Okay, so, before conditioning, no, during the dog, after the conditioning, so before the conditioning, ito yon, no, may food, bell, during conditioning, pinaris mo, yung food, tsaka bell, and after conditioning, bell lang, maglalaway na yung tao, yung aso pala. So before conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus food produces an unconditioned response salivation. Kaya unconditioned pa siya kasi hindi pa siya na-condition. And a neutral stimulus bell does not produce response. So, wala pa. Kasi neutral pa siya. So, NS pa siya. During conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus food is presented repeatedly just after presentation of neutral stimulus. Okay? So, yung unconditioned stimulus natin is presented repeatedly after the presentation of neutral. After conditioning, okay, the neutral stimulus alone produces the conditioned response salivation. So, unang gawin mo, bigyan mo muna ng food. Kung ano talagang pinaka-direct na naglalaway yung isang tao. Food. The next time around, bell muna, and then food. Bell, food. Paulit-ulitin mo repeatedly kasi to eh. After that, bell na lang, na-anticipate na kaagad ng aso, oy, baka itong bell next nito, food na to, bell, food. After bell na tulog, food. Kaya bell pa lang talaga, naglalaway ng isang tao. Okay, so, I've experienced this thing na pagdating ng papa ko, okay, pag presensya niya, may pasalubong, sumasaya ako, no? I become happy. So, may mga times na pagdating ng papa ko, masaya na ako kasi feeling ko may pasalubong na. Parang pag may pag may si Papa, pasalubong, masaya ako, si Papa pasalubong, the moment nakikita ko na yung father ko, naisip ko na agad, baka may pasalubong to, masaya na ako. And oftentimes, kahit walang pasalubong, masaya pa rin ako. Kasi I was conditioned na pagdating niya, may pasalubong. So, yun. Pairing a new neutral stimulus squeak with a conditioned stimulus is called, so ito pa rin, ano yung higher order conditioning or second order conditioning. So, pairing a new neutral stimulus squeak with a conditioned stimulus z is called higher conditioning or second conditioning. This means you are using the conditioned stimulus on the can opener. Well, pag nag-open na ng can to condition another stimulus, the squeaky cabinet, so yung cabinet na yon, okay, the squeaky cabinet, it is hard to achieve anything above second conditioning. For example, if you ring a bell, okay, open the cabinet squeak, use the can openers, and then feed tiger will likely never get sighted when hearing the bell tone. So, yan yun. So, example ito. Higher order or second order conditioning. Electric can opener, yan yung conditioned stimulus natin, plus food and conditioned stimulus equals salivation. So, squeaky of cabinet door, second order stimulus siya. Okay? Kasi dito tayo kumukuha ng can. An electric opener, so equal salivation. So, pwede mo rin ipares kung ano yung mga conditioning mo. Next, squeezy cabinet. Pag open lang ng cabinet mo, maglalaway na kaagad yung pusa. Kasi feeling ng pusa, oy, pag open mo ng cabinet, kukuha ka doon ng pagkain, tsaka i-open mo yun ng can. So, yan yung second order ng conditioning. In higher order conditioning, an established conditioned stimulus is paired with a new neutral. Bago yung yan yung mag-innovate ko ano yung ipapares mo. Neutral stimulus, the second order stimulus, so that eventually the new stimulus also elicits conditioned response without the initial conditioned stimulus being presented. So, ano yung general process ng classical conditioning? So, here we have this acquisition. So, in classical conditioning, the initial period, first pa lang, when an organism learns to connect the neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. So, when he is connecting, kinoconnect yung food sa yung bell. During acquisition, the neutral stimulus begin to elicit conditioned response. And eventually, the neutral stimulus became conditioned stimulus, capable of eliciting conditioned response by itself. Timing is important. Okay. Timing is important for condition occur. Example, food bell. Dapat talaga yung, example, yung interval niya is enough. Example, nag-ring ka ng bell. Tapos, 3 hours mo pa binigyan ng food. Sa tingin mo, yung pagsaliva niya or excitement ng hayop o pusa, nandyan pa yun, wala na yan. So, dapat yung timing or time interval yung tawag natin dyan is insakto. So, also extinction is the decrease in conditioned response with the conditioned stimulus is no longer presented. So, ito na yung sinasabi ko. Wala na nangyari kasi nga, late ka sa timing. When presented with a conditioned stimulus alone, the dog, cat, organisms would show a weaker response and finally no response. In classical conditioning terms, there is a gradual weakening kasi nga late ka. Ang crucial dyan yung timing mo. Kasi kaya nagkakameron siguro na extinction kasi nga, yung sabi ko, binigyan mo siya ng bell, late na yung food kasi you have lost your timing. The behavior of Pavlov's dog, the tiger loses a concept Pavlov called spontaneous recovery or the return of previously extinct conditioned response following the rest period. So, pwede mo rin ma-recover yung response. Na example, na late ka ng food sa aso mo, pwede kang magkamero na recovery dyan. Ulitin mo lang din naman. Ulitin mo lang din yung response mo. Okay? So, ito yon. Ito yung when an organism learns to respond differently to our various stimuli that are similar, it is called stimulus discrimination. So, may mga times na expectation mo salivation, pero kinagat ka, okay? Iba na yon, okay? Iba yung nagiging kuan dyan. So, ito yung kuan, table natin. So, here comes the time natin and strength of CR. So, acquisition, ito lang, yung CS plus conditions stimulus plus conditions stimulus, in-add mo siya, meron acquisition. But extinction, kung CS alone lang, dito, kung CS lang, na walang timing, wala pang timing, lilit yung chance niya per strength ng conditions response. Ang hirap i-condition pag CS lang. Dapat talaga consistency din yun. Consistency din kasi to. Spontaneous recovery, pwede mo yung ma-recover na behavior na yon. Okay po? So, it also is, on the other hand, when an organism demonstrates the condition response stimuli that are similar to the condition stimulus, it is called stimulus generalization. So, pag similar yung response niya sa iba-ibang stimulus mo, okay, yung tawag dyan is stimulus generalization, meaning na-generalize yung stimulus niya. Meaning, since ulit-ulit yung stimulus niya, it happens at generalization of stimulus. So, similar yung response niya. And the opposite of stimulus discrimination, meron din. So, ano yung habituation? Of course, when we learn not to respond to a stimulus that is presented repeatedly without change. As the stimulus occurred over and over, we learn not to focus our attention. For example, imagine that your neighbor roommate constantly has the television braining. So, example, ito na yung habituation. Example, may kapitbahay ka, ang ingay ng TV niya. At first, okay pa sa'yo. Kinonfront mo, hindi nakinig. Time and time goes by, narinig mo siya lagi, na-adapt mo na siya. Hanggang na-learn mo na, okay, maingay to, medyo maingay. It becomes a time sa'yo na okay na to, na-condition ka na, okay na lang, medyo maingay. So, it is already an habituation sa'yo. Kasi nga, na-condition ka na. Okay, for example, this background noise is distracting and makes it so difficult for you to focus your studying. However, over time, you became accustomed to the stimulus of the television noise and eventually, you hardly notice it no longer. So, yun na yung masama doon. You become compromised. It is, nag-compromise ka na. It becomes a habit to you, habituation. Naging habit mo na, okay. So, ganon. And also, let's move on to our second idea of learning. We have this behaviorism by famous John B. Watson. So, ano yung idea nito? John B. Watson is the founder of behaviorism, yes? Behaviorism is thought that arose during first part of the 20th century, which incorporate elements of Pavlovian. Meron pa siyang elemento ng Pavlovian physical condition. In what way? In stark contrast with Freud, who considered the reasons for behavior to be hidden in the unconscious. So, contrast pala siya Freud kasi hidden daw sa unconscious natin. Watson championed the idea that all behavior can be studied, okay? Ito yung idea niya talaga. Lahat ng behavior can be studied as simple stimulus-response behavior. Ulit-ulit lang. Stimulus-response reaction. Yan lang. Bigyan mo ng stimulus, may response, stimulus-response, ma-judge mo na kaagad. May studyhan mo na kaagad yung isang behavior, you learn something, ito mangyayari. Pag ulit-ulit na. Simple lang. Stimulus-response reaction, yun. Ang ibig sabihin doon, na naisabihan mo yung behavior ng isang tao. But without regard for internal processes. Labas dyan yung internal processes. Example, internal processes ng isang tao, paano kung damage yung medulla oblongata niya, damage yung frontal lobe niya. Labas na yan dyan. Okay? Ito lang, without regard lang siya. Okay? Watson argued that in order for psychology to become legitimate science, it must shift its concern away from internal mental processes because mental processes cannot be seen or measured. Tama. May idea din si Pavlov. No, ito yung sabi niya. Dapat na mag-shift din yung psychology from internal to external. Kasi nga, pag internal kasi, meaning sa brain processes lang, hindi mo nakikita, hindi mo siya naistabihan. Doktor lang nakikita, kailangan mo talagang butasan yung utak, buksan yung utak para makita na hindi. Behavior yung isabihan natin dito, hindi yung cells sa neurons. Pero, somewhat naman, meron din naman point yung internal processes ng brain. Because we have biopsychology and neurology, yung na-study about sa neurons. And it has factors naman. Kasi nga, related din kasi yung biology natin in psychology. So instead, he asserted that psychology must focus on outward. So ito yung sabi niya. Dapat mag-focus lang tayo sa outward accordingly to John Watson. Asserted must focus outward on outward observable behavior that can be measured. So, di ba sabi pa nga doon yata niya, I think it's in some philosophers, na yung knowledge daw is that thing that can be measured. Yan yung knowledge or intelligence. So, yan yung psychology, studying about mind and behavior neural processes. Sabi ni Watson, no, I argue. Sabi niya, he argued daw. Dapat nakikita lang natin, observable yung behavior. No? So, yan yung kang Watson. So, ito siya. John B. Watson used the principles of classical conditioning in the study of human emotion. So, ano yung related na ng behaviorism at saka yung classical conditioning ni Pavlov at yung behaviorism ni Watson? Ito lang, no? Stimulus, response, behavior. No, stimulus, response. Yan dito nga yung sabi ko. Stimulus, response, reaction. Ito lang. Ito yung similarity. Stimulus, response, meron ka nang mali-learn something and somewhat. Okay, yung medyo relatable sila. Watson's ideas were influenced by Pavlov's work, classical conditioning. And according to Watson, human behavior, just like animal behavior, is primarily the result of conditioned response. So sabi niya, yung behavior doon natin, condition to. Walang pag-anak sa'yo, meron ka ng response kaagad sa mga bagay-bagay. No, it was already conditions, meaning natutunan mo, nakita mo, it was a result of the stimulus na nakita natin sa paligid-ligid. Whereas Pavlov's work with dogs involved in condition with reflex, Watson believed that the same principles could be extended the conditioning of human emotion. So, medyo related din, nilapatan niya dito yung emotions. Thus began Watson's work with his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, and baby called the Little Albert. So, ito na yung study niya about Little Albert. Through the experiments with Little Albert, Watson and Rayner demonstrated how fear can be conditioned. So, ito din yung famous study nila. About the famous Albert, alam mo ito? Famous Albert, simple glimpse lang. Famous Albert was with his mom. So, gusto kasi nilang, ano yung natutunan na dito? That fear can be conditioned. Famous Albert, kasama niya yung mama niya, umalis bigla yung mama niya. May pumasok na ibang tao. Si Little Albert, nakita niya, hindi to mama ko Medyo takot na siya Wow, medyo awkward din sa kanya. Hanggang nalearn nila doon na even fear pala na condition. So, for example, crucial to sa society kasi nga, we are living in society about social control. For example, there is a crime and an issue of law order na. So, kaya palang i-condition yung tao na matakot sa gobyerno, sa mga pulis. Okay, ito yung result ng study nila about Little Albert. So, maybe you're going to have to read all about din sa behaviorism kasi medyo mataas din siya na topic. Pero, ito yung idea nila that may conditioning pa rin, that even fear can be conditioned. Okay, ito yung si Little Albert na subject na first experiment. How about operant conditioning? Okay, so in operant conditioning, organisms learn to associate behavior and its consequences. Okay? So, nagkaka-learn tayo ng behavior, okay, natin, sa mga consequences nito. For example, may reward. So, paulit-ulit natin ginagawa yan. Example like that, diba? Ay, gawin ko to para malaki yung grado ko. Hindi ko to gawin. Kasi baka liliit yung grado ko. So, a pleasant consequences makes the behavior likely to be repeated. So, pag maganda yung consequences ng action mo, ay ulit-ulitin mo yung isang bagay. For example, Spirit, a dolphin at National Aquarium in Baltimore, does a flip in the air when her trainer blows a whistle. Consequently, is that she gets a fish. Ngayon ko lang ito nalaman. Example, yung mga dolphin na nagtitricks, nung nagpi-flip. So, pag nakagawa sila ng flip nila, dapat bigyan mo kagad ng isda. Okay? Or reward. Kasi nga, a pleasant consequence makes the behavior more likely to be repeated. So, hindi yan magtitricks yung dolphin or yung aso mo kung wala kang reward. Kasi it's all about the consequences. Ayan. Reward is just a consequence. Okay? And classical and operant conditioning compared. So, here's our classical conditioning and our operant conditioning. So, conditioning approach. So, ano yung conditioning approach sa classical conditioning? In classical conditioning, ang conditioned stimulus as a food is paired with neutral stimulus such as bell. Meron siyang neutral stimulus. Yung unconditioned stimulus, meron pang isang stimulus na naman para magkameron ng salivation with bell. The neutral stimulus eventually becomes the conditioned stimulus which brings out the conditioned response to salivation. Okay, so example, parang pumunta ka ng dentist. Okay? Pumunta ka ng dentist. So, nabunot dun yung ngipin mo, tapos yung experience mo na yan, ang sakit. So, right now ngayon, dentist pa lang, makakita ka ng dentist, makakapil ka na ng sakit, ayaw mo na. So, na-condition ka na dentist pa lang, tapos yung mga injections, yung mga gamit ng dentist, yan yun, pairing. Yung presence ng dentist, baka yung uniform niya, mga gamit niya, nagka-condition ka na masakit. So, yun. How about conditioning approach sa operant conditioning sa ano siya? The target behavior is followed by reinforcement or punishment to either strengthen or weaken, so that learning is most likely to exhibit the desired behavior in the future. For example, gumawa ka ng bagay na to, ipapunish ka, bibigyan ka ng consequences. And, matitest doon kung gagawin mo yung bagay niya o hindi. So, ito yung mga approaches nila. How about stimulus timing? So, ano yung stimulus timing ng classical conditioning? So, the stimulus occurs immediately before the response. So, dapat talaga, yung stimulus talaga, before talaga, and immediately. Mabilisan talaga. How about in operant conditioning in terms of stimulus timing? Kasi kailangan timing talaga yung kailangan dito, no? The stimulus, either reinforcement or punish, occurs soon after the response. Ito yung kaibahan. Okay, yung stimulus ng classical before yung stimulus, sa operant after pa. Pag nagawa sa condition sa classical condition, nagawa mo yung bagay na yan kasi nga may before na stimulus prior to that. And sa operant, no, hindi mo yan gagawin o nagawa mo yan kasi nga may na-aspire ka na mangyari after that. Okay? So, psychologist Dave Skinner so that classical conditioning is limited. So, yung sabi niya, to existing behaviors that are reflexively elicited and it doesn't account for new behaviors such as riding a bike. He proposed a theory about how much behavior come about. Skinner believed that behavior is motivated by consequences we receive for the behavior. Reinforcement and punishment. Ito yung Skinner talaga to, no? His idea is learning is result of consequences is based, so ito yung operant conditioning yung kang Biff Skinner, siya talaga yung operant conditioning. His idea is learning is result of consequences is based on the law of effect, which was first proposed by psychologist Edward Thorndike. So, law and effect, pwede rin siya maging katulad na in every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Pwede rin ito, may law of effect talaga. So, kinapi niya to sa psychologist na si Thorndike. So, according to the law of effect, behavior are followed by consequences are satisfied to the organism more likely to be repeated. So, yan din yung effect, and behaviors that are followed by pleasant consequences are less likely to be repeated. Katulad lang din. So, ito yung kang Biff Skinner, yung daga, na may mga, pag tinuplok niya yung ganyan, pinoint niya, may gagawas na pagkain, at yung pula, kuryente yung lalabas. So, na-learn niya na hindi pala siya dapat tutuplok yung sa isa kasi nga kuryente yung lalabas. So, pinaulit-ulit na niya. Hindi niya ginawa yung bagay na yun. So, in discussing operant conditioning, we use several everyday words like positive, negative reinforcement, and punishment. So, simple lang yung words dito. In a specialized manner, in operant conditioning, positive and negative do not mean good and bad. So, yung positive and negative does not mean good and bad. So negative, bad yan. So, negative kasi, ginagamit din yan para maka-enforce ng behavior na positive. Okay? Instead, positive means you're adding something. Okay? Don't forget this. Pag positive means you are adding something, consequences. No? Positive consequences, you're adding something. Negative something means you are taking away something. May kinukuha ka. Okay? So, yun yung positive. So, reinforcements means you are increasing a behavior. Okay? And punishment means you are decreasing behavior. So, pag nire-enforce mo, meaning, gusto mong mangyari yung behavior paulit-ulit kasi maganda yung behavior. Punishment, ayaw mo yung behavior na yan, gusto mo siyang i-punish. Reinforcement can be positive and negative. Punishment can also be negative or positive. So, all reinforcers, positive and negative, increase. So, lahat ng all reinforcers, positive or negative, increase the likelihood or behavior response. All punishers, positive or negative, decrease the likelihood. So, kahit pa positive, kung positive siya na gusto mong maulit yung isang bagay, no, na mangyari, positive reinforcer siya, At kung gusto mong kunin yung isang bagay, para maulit yung isang bagay, reinforcer pa rin siya. Pero kung gusto mo siyang i-punish, ito yung punishment decrease the likelihood behavior. Now, let's combine this for positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So, positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. So, example, reinforcement muna tayo. Ano yung positive reinforcement? Something is added to increase the likelihood of behavior. So, yan. How about positive punishment? Something is added, to decrease the likelihood of the behavior. Okay? How about negative reinforcement tayo? Something is removed to increase the likelihood. So, pag positive siya, increase talaga siya. Dapat mag-increase. Increase yung aspiration mo. Okay? Increase. Kahit pa, nire-remove mo at inadan mo. And in negative punishment, something is removed to decrease the likelihood of behavior. So, gusto mo i-punish yung behavior na yan, may kukunin ka para magbawasan yung behavior niya. Gusto mo yung behavior na yan, may i-remove ka para mas more and more, may reinforcement behavior. Reinforcement schedule. So, ito yung sabi ko. Kasi dapat yung reinforcement natin, pag condition sa isang bagay, kailangan ng, most important thing. 1, 2, timing. Okay? It must have perfect timing para mag-condition mo. Yan yung idea ng Pavlovian kasi. Dapat mga timing. So, reinforcement schedule, fixed interval, ano yung description niya. Reinforcement is delivered in a predictable time. Ito yung mga interval. Example, after 5, 10, 15, and 10 minutes. So, ito yung, don't forget this, ito yung fixed interval. Result, moderate response rate with significant pauses after reinforcement. Example, hospital patient uses patient-controlled doctor's time pain relief. So, example, binibigyan ka ng yung pain reliever, di ba? Mayroon yung time. Okay, so patient uses patient control or doctor time pain relief. Yan. So, how about sa reinforcement schedule na variable interval? So, reinforcement is delivered at unpredictable time. So, unpredictable siya. Yung kaibahan niya, okay? Predictable dito kasi nga by time at may interval talaga. 5, 10, count mo. Dito, unpredictable siya kasi, example, after 5, 7, 10, unpredictable talaga siya 10 minutes. Still moderate yet steady response. Example, checking Facebook. Yan, yun yung nangyayari. So, how about this reinforcement schedule? Ano pa to? Fixed ratio. By ratio naman tayo. Reinforcement schedule. So, description, reinforcement is delivered after a predictable number of responses. So, pag meron ng after na sa response, after 2, 4, example, pag nagawa mo to, bibigyan ka ng ganito in 2 to 4, 8 responses. After response na yan. Result, high response pa rin with pauses after reinforcement. Example, piecework, factory worker getting paid for every X number items manufactured. Example, yung mga factory worker, nagawa silang watch, bibigyan sila kaagad ng ganito, incentive, every nagawa nila, it's fixed ratio. Fixed yung ratio niya. Every number yung responses. Ito yung response niya, may nagawa siya. How about fixed variable? Reinforcement is delivered after an unpredictable number of responses. Okay, so, unpredictable siya kasi nga, yung intervals niya, ito 1, after 1, 40. So, high and steady response. Example, gambling. Yan talaga yung mangyayari sa gambling. Now, how about observational learning? So, ano yung observational learning? Okay? So, observational learning will learn by watching others and then imitating, modeling. So, meaning, nalalearn mo yung isang bagay na sa'yo kasi nga, may na-observe ka, na-imitate mo. What they do or say, ano yung ginawa nila, ano yung sinabi nila. The individuals perform imitated behavior called models. Performing the imitated behavior. So, yung individuals na yun, na nag-imitate tayo natin, sila yung called na mga, modelo. Research suggests that this imitative learning involves a specific type of neuron called the mirror neuron. So, meron pala tayong mirror neuron. Okay, sabi ito ng mga researchers. Ito yung part sa brain natin na imitate tayo. Okay. Example ito, parang yung unggoy. Uminom yung tao, uminom din siya. Okay? Okay, so this spider monkey learned to drink water from a plastic bottle by seeing. So, he's seeing, di ba? Nakita niya. Behavior modeled by a human. So, yung model dyan is itong tao. Okay? So, imitation is much more obvious in humans. But is imitation really sincere form of flattery? So, pag kinopyo ang isang tao, nakaka-flatter na? Hindi ba siya copyright? Okay? In imitation, a person simply copies the model. Thus, observational learning is much more complex. According to Reflexes, there are several ways observational learning can be occurred. So, meron pala, complex pa yung observational learning, hindi lang, nakita mo, okay? Sabi niya dito, ni Reflexes, you learn and you response by observation. Example, after watching your worker get chewed, pag pinagalitan ng boss for coming late, nalalearn mo na, dapat mag-aga na ako. May nalalearn kang new behavior. Next is, you choose whether or not to imitate depending on what happened to the model. So, ano nangyari, makakapili ka. Next is, you learn general rule that you can apply to the other situation. Nakaka-learn ka, meron ka option kung yung gagawin mo naman. Okay? So, ito yon. Ito yung observation learning. Ito yung yoga. Yoga students learn by observation of their yoga instructors, demonstrate the correct stance and movements for students' model. The second picture is, models don't have to be present for learning occur. Through symbolic modeling, the child can learn behavior by watching demonstration on TV. TV lang nakakalearn yung bata kasi he's seeing something. Sabi mga, di ba, the eyes is the mirror of our soul. Ano yung pumapasok, lumalabas dyan, yan yung nalalearn natin. Okay, so ano yung steps ng modeling? Paano tayo nakakalearn by just modeling other people? Of course, we don't learn a behavior simply by observing. Hindi pwedeng naka-observe kayo. So, sabi to ni Bandura describes specific steps. Ano yung steps na gano'n na nangyayari? Na nakaka-learn talaga tayo by observation. Hindi na pwedeng nakita mo lang. May mga nakita tayo sa mga bagay-bagay, sa mga paligid, na wala naman tayong na-learn. So, ito yung talagang may na-observe ka in observational learning at na-learn mo talaga siya at the end. Bandura describes specific steps in process of modeling that must be followed at learning to be successful. First is attention. So, huwag niyong kalimutan yung abbreviation ARRN. Okay? Attention, reproduction, and motivation. So first, you must be focused on what the model is doing. Focus ka. It must be focus yung attention mo dyan para makalearn ka talaga. You have to pay attention. The next is retention. Next, you must be able to retain or remember what you observed. Kung focus ka talaga dyan, minimemorize mo siya. Then, you must be able to perform the behavior that you observe and committed memory. Okay? Since, sabi nga dito, committed to memory. Memorizing mo talaga. That's the power sa education natin. Kailangan mong memorizing to. Okay? So, na-reproduce mo siya kasi nga, you have your attention, you have your retention, and you already reproduce the action. And finally, you must have the motivation. Bakit mo ginawa yan? Kasi hindi ka maglalast pag wala kang motivation. You need to want to copy the behavior, and whether or not you are motivated depends on what happens to the model. So if you saw the model is reinforced by behavior, you will more motivated to copy this. So pag may na-learn ka, na-reinforce ka, this non-vicarious reinforcement. Pag you saw the model reinforce the behavior. On the other hand, if you observe the model being punished, less motivated yan. Ang called yan is vicarious punishment. So vicarious reinforcement, vicarious punishment. Okay, so next tayo sa thinking. Since we have learned something and are learning how we learn, now how we think. So when we learn something, it means we are thinking what we are doing and what we learn. So learning objectives, by the end of this section, you will be able to learn about describe cognition, these guys concept and prototypes, and explain the difference between natural and artificial concepts. Simply put, okay, cognition is thinking, and it encompasses the process associated with perception, knowledge, problem solving, language. Yan pala yung cognition. Pag we're talking about cognition, that's already thinking. That's already a cognitive process. Scientists who study cognition are searching for ways to understand how we integrate, organize, utilize conscious cognitive experience without being aware of or conscious of the work of our brain. So, yan yung cognition natin na hindi yung mga scientists, yun yung i-studyhan nila. Paano tayo nakakalain ng mga bagay, paano tayo nag-iisip unconsciously. Okay? So, cognition, upon waking each morning, you began thinking. contemplating the task that you must complete the day. In what order you run your errands? Should you go to the bank, cleaners, or grocery store first? Can you get this done before you head to the class, or you need to wait until school is done? These thoughts are one of the condition of work. So, yun yung mga thoughts na yan. Exceptionally complex, di ba, is an essential feature of human consciousness. Yet, not all aspects of cognition are consciously experienced. So, ano yung cognitive psychology? Ito yung branch ng psychology, which field of psychology dedicated to examining how people think. It attempts to explain how and why people think the way they do by studying interaction among thinking, emotions, creativity, language, and problem-solving. Example, by just thinking, ano yung pag-iisip mo dito? Ikaw yung taong yan. Ano yung emotion mo sa picture na to? Ikaw yung taong yan. Gumawa ka ng ito, creative ka. Ano yung the way you speak, no, the way you solve problems. Yan yung cognitive psychology. Nastudihan nila yan. Kasi all of this is the study of behavior. How you're learning relate to your behavior, how you're thinking relate to your behavior. Yan yung study ng cognitive psychology. They are dedicated to how people think in connection to how they behave. Okay? So, how about concepts and prototypes? So, ano yung concepts and prototypes? So, sabi nga dito, sensation and information are received by your brain. So, merong stimulus dyan, how you sense something. And that sense become information. That stimulus become information. Pinaprocess yan ng mind mo, no, by memories or by emotion. Pag may nakita ka dyan, may emotion na nangyayari, wow, ang saya mo, malungkot ka. Kasi nga may information, may sensation. And that emotion, that information processed by emotion, will suddenly create a thought or cognitive process thinking. At itong lahat ng to, this is a cognitive process. Okay, so, by sensation, processed by emotion, and more likely you will have the thought. Concepts, ano yung concepts? Are categories of grouping linguistic information, ideas, so yung konsepto lang sa mind mo. No, konsepto lang. No, may concept ka ng mabuting tao, may concept ka ng maganda, may concept ka ng success, concept lang. It's just ideas, images lang sa mind mo. Hindi talaga siya concrete. Okay? So, prototype. So, yung prototype, this is an example of representation of a concept. So, prototype, it means, no, meron ka example. Meron kang concept. Okay? Meron kang concept sa isang magandang babae. So, yung prototype mo, maybe artista siya or singer siya. So, it is, may nag-represent sa concept mo. It becomes a concrete category. Okay? So, example nito, si Muhammad Gandhi yata to. So, sabi pa nga dito, Muhammad Gandhi is an poetic title. So, ano yung sabi dito? Is an example of peace. Diba? May mga words of wisdom siya. So, maybe ang concept dyan is man of peace. Okay? And maybe a good prototype is Gandhi. I don't know him personally. So, Muhammad Gandhi served as a non-violent force of independence for India. So, demanding Buddhists, Muslims, it's all about taxi, yung sinulong nila. How about natural and artificial concepts? So, natural, so in psychology, concepts are divided into categories. So, yung konsepto pala, nakadivide sa two categories. We have natural concepts. So, yung konsepto ng natural concepts are created naturally. Through your experiences can be developed from either experiences. So, natural talaga. Na-create siya naturally. Okay? Example yung sa snow. May nakita ang snow. It was created in natural. In artificial concepts, no, sabi dito, artificial concept, the other hand, is a concept that is defined by a specific set of characteristics. Ano to? Various properties of geometric shapes, may mga squares na, may mga shape na serves as useful examples of artificial concepts. Okay? So, yun yung schemata. Schemata is a mental construct consisting of a class of collection of related concepts. So, yung schemata mo dyan, pag marami ka ng concept, ano yung kabuuan yan, yan yung schemata mo. So, ano yung role schemata? Makes assumption about how individual certain roles behavior. Example, yung role schemata mo, concepts mo ng isang role ng isang tao. For example, imagine you meet someone, introduce him sa firefighter. So, yung role concept mo dyan sa firefighter, pag may nakita ka ng firefighter, naisip mo, baka matapang to, baka ganito mo yan. But still, it's not absolute. Baka pala firefighter lang siya kasi nga, malaki yung sweldo pero hindi pala siya brave talaga. So event schemata, also known as cognitive script, is a set of behavior that can be feel like a routine. Think about when you do walk to an elevator. First, the doors is open. So, parang scripted na siya, di ba? Example, anong example ito ng event schemata? Example, papasok ka sa elevator, first gagawin mo, tatayo ka dyan, maghihintay ka. Next is, papasok, magtutuplukin ka. Pag ma-open na yung door sa'yo, papasok ka sa elevator, tatalikod ka naman. Ulit-ulit yan, it becomes a routine sa'yo. So, tanong lang, anong ginagawa mo sa elevator? So, what event schemata, ito yung last question, do you perform riding an elevator? Can you think your answer? Okay. So, yun lang, no? And